The first thing Shu Xin noticed about him was how steady his hands were when he wrapped the paper napkin around the cracked teacup. It was a small kindness in a noisy room. Her mother's cousins arguing over tea leaves, her aunt reminding her that time was a luxury she did not own, and the cheap watch on the mantel ticking like a judge. Shu Xin had come to the inspection tired, practiced at smiling at relatives who asked when she would finally marry, and wondering which of their questions would bruise her that week. She had booked the actor because it felt like the only useful kind of deception left, one that could buy her a weekend of peace, a plausible exit from the marriage interrogations that had become part of family dinner. He introduced himself as an account manager. He sat with an easy posture, shrugged at the jokes, and paid attention to the small domestic rhythms where the teapot was kept, which cushion the grandmother refused to let anyone touch. When her father test drove the cardboard sincerity of the conversation. So, what are your plans? Realistic ones. The man watched Shu Xin with the kind of look that missed none of the fissures and none of the tenderness. He didn't ask to be performed for. He seemed to be listening for a language he already knew. Shu Xin's receipt from the agency still sat folded in her purse, like a guilty talisman. Rent-a-boyfriend agencies did brisk business in the city, handling everything from staged breakups to full weekend family simulations. She had told herself she would be blunt, no feelings. Work done, money exchanged. The man Jiu Mingshu, according to the polite name on his card, was supposed to be a role. A role had boundaries. A real person did not. By the time the cousins had gone home, and the grandmother had fallen asleep under the lamp, Mingshu had stayed to help wash the dishes, and when he noticed a small crack in one of the teacups, he took the napkin from Shu Xin's hands, and, with a deliberate gentleness, patted the break with it, as if mending something larger than porcelain. You didn't have to do that, she said, half embarrassed, half grateful. He shrugged, the briefest of smiles. Some things are worth fixing whether they cost money or not. It was the first of many small calculations that would later rearrange both their lives. A measured kindness, a look held past the pretense, and the soft revelation that roles could blur into wrecking and repair. He passed the inspection. Her mother returned to the kitchen beaming and sang, to anyone who would listen, of how lucky Shu Xin was to have found a sensible match. Shu Xin kept half a smile, and the other half of her face brandished like armor. She had dodged one kind of pressure. Another, she knew, would take its place. The next morning, over an instant message that read like a rehearsed accent, "Pleased to meet you, Minshu." Minshu was professional, brief, and courteous. He handed back the agency fee and a card with a real name on it. Gu Mingshu. Shu Xin, who had worked her way up the editorial ladder by learning whose names moved markets and whose names were masking tactics, didn't look for hidden signatures. She thought, briefly, that he had been honest enough for the job. What she could not have known was how the city had room for two faces under one name. Outside the small apartment where Shu Xin lived, the skyline leaned in all white glass and neon. The same skyline also hid rooms where names carried weight the way credit did. Jiu Mingshu could carry lunch in a paper bag and ride the same subway as the clerk who delivered packages, and he could do it without being noticed, but there were people who guarded his privacy the way a family keeps a secret recipe. He knew how to fold himself small. He was careful where he set down his words. He treated small things as if they were oaths. At the editorial office, Shu Xin's desk was a constellation of annotated proofs and sticky notes on arsenal. Against the chaos of deadlines, she had earned a reputation for getting to the core of a story, for seeing the angle that made the public care. She was not a woman who wanted to be rescued. She wanted, quietly and insistently, to be able to breathe. When Wayward Luck arranged for Mingshu to appear at the launch party of a charity supplement she was editing, it was under the pretense of being a cousin of a board member. He wore a tie that matched the navy of her blazer, and he moved through the overdressed crowd with a nonchalance that could have been training, or could have been habit. People made assumptions, they smiled at him, as if he belonged, and he smiled back, like someone who understood the currency of a smile. There, under decorative lights, the first threads of something unmistakable took form. He listened when Shu Xin talked about an editorial problem, and when she spoke about a columnist whose sources had dried up, he suggested, not to show off, but to steer the conversation gently toward options she hadn't considered. It was Smola an idea about a community source, a local charity that could corroborate a story, but it showed that he could follow a conversation through, from problem to solution. Shu Xin felt it then. Anyone who cares enough to follow the thread all the way to the knot is rarer than people who know what to say at the party. Someone at the party left in a hurry, and Mingshu stayed longer than was necessary. When they walked out under the cold street lamps, Shu Xin felt a hesitation she hadn't budgeted for. She was the woman who booked pretenses. She had not expected to become porous under them. He handed her a jacket in the wind without a word, as if that was the most logical next step in the story. "You're not just an actor," she said once, before she could fold her defenses back into place. It wasn't a question she planned to ask. It slid out of her like someone testing the warmth of a scarf against skin. He looked at her, candid and safe. I do other things." The line hung between them like a suspended note. He did not elaborate. He did not have to. The city supplies hints as easily as it does secrets. That evening, as people posted filtered photographs and bland captions about charity and community on social accounts, Shu Xin sat at her little kitchen table with a mug gone cold. She had no illusions about romance. The actor had come, fulfilled his part, and left. She had a receipt to prove the transaction, and yet, the jacket smelled faintly of his cologne. On the hanger, nothing from the parties at the top floor, something clean and ordinary, and the empty apartment around her felt, for a moment, less like a stage, and more like a privacy someone had helped reclaim. 2 weeks passed, with the measured pace of routine. Mingshu texted now and then, showed messages that were never intrusive. He offered tips for a source, forwarded an article with a single line marked, and sent a photograph of a bookstore where the rain made the windows glow like stained glass. His presence was patient. It didn't command. Shu Xin began to answer him, not as if to a hired actor, but as if to someone whose opinions mattered in small, sensible ways. For Mingshu, the part-time actor, the part-time account manager, there were other doors that opened fast when necessary, and closed fast when discretion demanded. Facades in the city are like skins. Some people wear them for warmth, others as armor. A well-placed call could make a manager remember a meeting. A certain last name could reschedule a whole calendar without a blush. Mingshu had been taught not to advertise the weight he could carry. He carried it like a spare umbrella, rarely used, but reliable when storms came. Gao Manley stepped into the picture like every arranged necessity should. Confident, cool, and perfectly suited to the contours of a family portrait. She was the kind of woman people described with business metaphors. Strategic, and acid, and she performed the role of betrothed, with the kind of clinical competence reserved for boardrooms. She smiled in cameras, she smiled better in staged photographs. She smelled faintly of lilies, and the expensive kind of determination. Her first introduction to Shu Xin happened at a charity luncheon attended by the same social set that liked to wrap decisions in notes and signatures. Manly's smile was look. Her questions were ice-thin and precise. She measured Shu Xin with a look that catalogued annoyances. Not the man who had been at the dinner, but the woman who, by proximity, threatened a dictated narrative. The matriarch, Ji Wanyu, watched carefully. She had a face the family recognized as the bank of tradition. She could, with one tilted brow, approve or quarantine a person like a risk assessment. She had nurtured Mingshu's public modesty with an old-fashioned sense of prudence. Appearances had a cost, and their family paid it in restraint. She did not like surprises. For someone like Ji Wanyu, a rental boyfriend was a small misstep. A woman who booked such a role was a variable that needed to be evaluated. Mingshu had been introduced to Ji Wanyu in the conservative hush of a boardroom. He had presented himself as a man who understood obligation. He had been deferential with a practiced sincerity. Ji Wanyu had watched the way he folded deference into competence, and decided at least for now that he was manageable. What she could not abide was threats to the family's control of narrative. When that was challenged, Ji Wanyu's stitches tightened. From that day, the orbit altered. Manly fitted into the family's plans like a glove. The family favored arrangements that produced the right kind of legacy. Mingshu found his small freedoms, bracketed by obligations and subtle expectations. He navigated it with the sort of economy infrequently visible to those he encountered in the cafes and editing rooms. He kept the part of himself that belonged to other rooms, small. He didn't mention meetings he had missed. He smiled and said the right things. He hid a pocket of anger under his coat, the way a man might hide a medical note. It was not that Manly was an enemy the first time they met. She became one. The more Shu Xin became visible within Mingshu's orbit. The world likes tidy stories. The right match. The right parties. The right photos. When a woman like Shu Xin, who was not from the currency of pedigree, started to matter to a man connected to pedigree, ripples formed. People who had everything to lose have a way of attaching urgency to the smallest menace. The first smear began as a small, precise blade. A photograph anonymous accounts started pushing online. A picture from a decade ago cropped and captioned with insinuations. The comment threads were easy to seed anonymous accounts. A few planted witnesses, recollecting things with manufactured nostalgia. Shu Xin watched the tide of rumor build with the helplessness of someone watching a kitchen fire. She called her friends, sent screenshots to her editor, and received in return the cold calculus of professional risker publisher would distance themselves until proof was public and convenient. At the office, the senior editor, Wang Di, spoke in tones that mixed concern with commerce. You know how this works, Xin. Opinion moves faster than truth. He suggested she'll take leave, or perhaps it would be simpler if she resigned. The implication was soft, but clear. Reputations are assets and liabilities, and the house must survive. The editorial room buzzed with whispers. Someone always needed a scapegoat to prove the house's impartiality. Shu Xin refused to let them decide for her. She did not go easy. She printed the photographs and studied the edges, the light, the paper grain. The part of her that had become an editor was not easily cowed. It saw patterns and inconsistencies where others saw scandal. She began to pull at threads. The possible sources of the images, the accounts that had pushed them, and who had a motive to push them. She used the quiet rigor that had earned her a certain cross-referencing, contacting people who would not answer without being asked by the right person. She suggested a retraction strategy to her superior end. When it was dismissed as idealistic, she kept working outside of work hours, assembling the quiet facts. This was not a girl who waited to be saved. She was a woman who documented a crime and labeled it properly, who would later demand that the labels be taken seriously. Mingshu watched her handle the smear like someone reading a fight scene and learning a new move. He admired her refusal to be passive in the face of a narrative that would rather she disappear. From his side of the room, between boardroom demands and dinner table calculus, he began to collect evidence in small ways. An archived social post a disgruntled schoolmate had forgotten to delete, a poorly cropped pixel that refused to lie, a name that surfaced again and again at the margins of a network. He moved quietly, the way he had always done. He did not talk about it at the dinner table. He did not file grandly. He wrote short, practical messages, a source, a contact, an address. He used money the way someone uses fertilizer, sparingly, to encourage growth in the right places. He paid for a private analyst to examine a photograph, not to score himself points at a family dinner, but to create verifiable facts. He offered to take on hospital bills for a local shelter that served witnesses. He did things he did not want his mother to see in the ledger of moral accounting. The smear campaign, once started, found momentum. People in Manly's corner circulated possible regret, a past of the kind that scares sponsors and furtive partners away. It ate at the table's edge, like rust. The city's appetite for scandal is literal. Clicks, shares, and mentions become currency. Shu Xin's editor desk was suddenly a theater of gossip-motivated decisions. A sponsor whispered they'd like their name removed from the supplement if certain inconvenient figures remained attached. The paper shifted like a ship in a storm. When Shu Xin refused an offer of hush money, envelope slid under the table at a lunch with a lawyer she had not called. She felt the quiet of making a decision that would isolate her. "We can make this go away," the lawyer said. It was not a threat, it was a fact. Simple as a trade. Shu Xin pushed the envelope back with the firmness of someone who had learned to keep her hands uncluttered. "I will not buy silence with their money," she said. "I need the truth." The man, elegantly bored, looked at her as if assessing whether she would pose a risk to the scale of things. To him, she was a variable. To Shu Xin, it was an ethical line she would not cross. She would not pay the premium that wealth demanded for the quiet. Meanwhile, the narratives fed into the public moved faster than anyone's resolve. Ang arenjido fayang. Feeling the tremor of an unexpected variable in the market of marriage, tightened her grip. Manly began to whisper in the ears of those who most mattered, the matriarchs, the sponsors, the social accounts that had built their reputations on curated righteousness. She did not need to be loud. She relied on the network, the filters, the people who translated insinuation into policy. When a rumor becomes an instrument, it is precise. The first violent scene was not cinematic in its ferocity. It was the small, precise violence of a shove in a crowded hallway, of someone pushing through a crowd with purpose. Shu Xin, heading home from a late meeting, was confronted by a group that had been waiting. It was a collision designed to do one thing: escalate. The shove made her stumble. She fell against the railing of the glass atrium. An emergency call flashed on a passerby's phone. Hands reached, and someone shouted for help. That was how the public would later remember the moment, as a chaotic accident. Those who had orchestrated it preferred language that concealed intention. When they found her in the hospital corridor hours later, pale and drifting, the monitors were loud as judgment. The doctors used language with the economy of people trained to avoid sentimentalism. "Observation," one said. "Possible head trauma. We'll keep her under sedation while we run scans." The way the team moved through the room was sober. Medicine had a cadence that did not match drama. In the waiting area, Mingshu sat like someone who had not expected to feel fear that physically, and then had to take up residence behind his ribs. Ji-won Yu arrived first at the hospital with a composed face that betrayed the smallest crack of worry. She issued brisk instructions, like a commander organizing a quiet defense. "Make sure she has the best neurologist," she told the nurse. "Check the scans." Again, there was no kindness in her voice, only a decisive efficiency that had never been permitted to show softness. She translated her concern into action, currency into appointments, and left the warmth for lists. Gal Manley arrived in a different mode. She moved through the hospital with a camera-ready expression, carefully curated grief that read well in photographs. She positioned herself for optics condolence, concern, control. Her phone hummed with messages from acquaintances, concerned about what this might mean for engagements. A few of her friends floated the idea of making a public statement. She demurred, choosing instead to let the machine of rumor run in the background while she shaped its destination. at the same time? The newsroom's pragmatism had hardened into the default. Wang Di called Shu Xin's emergency contact and asked for an official statement for the paper. "Just the facts," he said. "Whatever you want, we will run with clarity." The request came with the implied softness of a petunia. "Be careful what you say. The press is a blade that cuts both ways." In the hospital corridor, during the long hours that people call the quiet, Mingshu found himself at the edge of a decision he had not expected to make. His phone vibrated with messages from his mother, concern smoothed with a reminder about the family calendar. There were also messages from Manly's side, voices asking him to remember the optics of a public figure. "This is not a good look." One text read, "You should arrange a statement." Mingshu folded his hands and thought about the inspection night, about the way she had patched a teacup with careful fingers, without asking for notice. He thought about the envelope she had returned, the offer of a hush. He thought of the empty apartment where warmth had been stacked like plates, and he felt the weight of more than one life in his palms. In the press room, rumors turned into a public vital sign. The images of Shu Xin being helped into the ambulance appeared across feeds. Anonymous accounts, which had started the smear, now spread the wound's image, as if to prove their version of the story. The machine that monetized outrage clicked through its motions. Mingshu asked to see the scans that night, and the cardiologist's assessment in the morning. He argued with hospital administration over who could be by her bedside. He paid for the private room no one had asked to rent for him. He did these things like someone building a net from materials he did not want to have to use. He was careful with his moves because he knew the stakes were not only personal. A single poorly chosen gesture could be turned into another scandal. It was during the first flurry of family pressure that Gao Manly did what the title would later remember in crisp, unforgiving language. She formally and publicly distanced herself from him. They called it a necessary clarification at first. A statement released on her agent's account mentioned a misalignment of values, and the importance of clarity in public commitments. The words were pink and antiseptic. Ji Wanyu, watching the shaping of this message, nodded with a face like carved stone. The networks accepted the language and translated it into headlines that suggested Mingshu's choices had created a reputational risk. At the hospital, Mingshu read the statement on his phone and felt something cold. He called Manly. She did not pick up. He texted. She answered with one line. "Please don't make this about me." That line, elegant and implacable, was a closed door. In the days that followed, the first official disentanglement, the city's whispers hardened into a chorus of exclusion. Invitations stopped arriving for Mingshu. Board meetings continued without him. Ji Wanyu received a call from a board member who suggested maybe it was better if the family's donations were handled by another branch of the company for a while. A mother's network, subtle and effective, began to separate assets and people with the efficiency of a surgeon from tissue. Mingshu stood in a corridor of a building whose marble still smelled like money and watched the doors close in succession. Those doors translated into expectations that he had shown himself unable to meet. He was not disowned with a scream. He was excluded with a shrug. A string of board minutes, and the practiced civility of people who could afford to cut ties without messy drama. It hurt less like betrayal, and more like an erasure by polite hands. He felt small in a way he had not expected. He had always known that in his family, appearance could congeal into destiny. The right match, the right alliances, the right photograph. He had conformed without complaint for years, folding himself into the family story with the patience of someone who understands the arithmetic of privilege. But when the world polished him to remove what it liked, least his messy loyalty to a woman who had the temerity to refuse hush money, the calculus changed. The closed doors began to look like a mirror. That moment, the text, the decision, the quiet shuddering of invitation lists, was the turning hinge. The title promised, not the trauma itself, not the smear, but the public refusal of the fiancé to be associated with him. It was a measured rejection, administered in PR language, that was intended to protect reputations, but ended up naming a different kind of cost. By shutting him out, Manley illuminated the choice before him, as if under surgical lights. The career his family had carved out for him, or the messy, inconvenient loyalty to a woman who was being punished for refusing to sell her silence. For a day or two Mingshu considered the path most people expected of him. He could choose the path of deference again. Apologize in public. Distance himself from Shu Xin, as if he had never known her. Step into a future where his obligations matched the family ledger. He might be rewarded with resumed invitations, a place in the next contract signing, a photograph where his name was mentioned without scandal. But the thought felt like a hollowing. The person he would have to become in that image was not the man who had patched a teacup with a napkin. He found that the thought of stepping away from Shu Xin because it benefited a ledger made him feel not like a man who was protecting his family, but like someone who had sold the currency of his conscience for the expedience of a comfortable lie. Late that night, in the private room where the hospital's fluorescent buzz receded into the rhythm of machines, he sat by her bed and watched the slow movements of her breathing. Her hair fanned the pillow like a dark halo. A thin bandage caught the light on her temple. He saw, in the smallness of the room, what money could not replicate: the fragile, human economy of care. He planned for long hours of advocacy and analysts for the photographs, legal counsel to file defamation claims, an independent psychiatrist to make sure the public narrative could not cheapen trauma into spectacle. He would arrange for the best care. Yes, but beyond the list of practicalities, something in him was shifting. A slow, stubborn priority that had nothing to do with name placements or approvals. When his mother called, she asked if he was sure about the optics. When Jiwan Yu sent a voice note, it said less and commanded more. Think carefully. This family has choices to make. Manley's text remained the same. 8 minimalist words, folded like a seal. The outside world pinched at the edges of his life, with 1,000 small fingers. He stayed. He paid for the additional scans. He argued for privacy. He asked for witness statements from people who had been at the scene. He made sure the editor, who had pushed for Shu Xin's resignation, was not allowed to slide it off as a corporate mistake. He quietly called an analyst he trusted, Qinyu, an assistant to Parader, kind of friend he'd met in another life, and who had remarkable access to little administrative loopholes. Qinyu arranged an appointment with the forensic image analyst, who could examine metadata. Mingshu's voice on that call was calm and practical, not performative. He made lists in his head, the way someone building a shelter drafts materials. He also, in private, allowed himself a single truth. The woman in the hospital had taught him something about the weight of small acts. The napkin was a symbol, the rustle of it wrapped around the teacup like a covenant. He had been shown that the things that matter are often invisible until they break, and when they break, they demand a response that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with fidelity. By the time the first forensic report came back, the tenor of the city's rumor mill had not softened. The report, however, did what forensic reports are supposed to do. It described and documented pixels, color mismatches, camera model discrepancies, technical language that turned insinuation into testable assertion. The image of a smear began to reveal its seams. When Mingshu put the report in the hands of the attorney and watched the defense's fine handwriting begin to worry about contracts, he did not feel triumphant. He felt responsible. He felt tired. He felt as if the choices before him had magnified from cosmetic inconveniences into a moral geography he had to traverse with care. Shu Xin remained sedated for days. The hospital bracelets and IV lines became the only things that remembered the name of her body for her. The city turned its face elsewhere when news cycles tired of images. For the people who loved her, the work of care was quiet, methodical, and boring. It consisted of documents, phone calls, and the fortified patience of someone who understands that recovery is measured in small reinforcements rather than grand declarations. And then, in a meeting room that smelled faintly of coffee, Shu received a message that read, like a verdict, a formal invitation to present at a family council event that usually ended in decisions more architectural than emotional. The message was precise and practiced, as if every word had been voted on. Ji-won-yu's signature sat at the bottom like a seal. Manli had already made her choice public. Now the family wanted to close ranks, to clarify their position, to decide on the optics that would render Shu safe again or not. The invitation was less an invitation than a summons. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that the family expected him to make a concession, to smooth the data points into a narrative that would restore balance. The family had public resources to allocate, and the capacity to decide quietly whether someone would be allowed back into the tapestry. The calculus was explicit. His marriage prospects, the company's image, the social obligations that rested like a crown. It all looked like a ledger, waiting for a ledger to be balanced. He went. Anyway, he wore the jacotable hand of defiance, an outfit chosen to be neither arrogant nor downcast, and met his mother and the board in a room that smelled of varnished wood. Faces that were usually soft with familial patience had sharpened in the last weeks. The argument that would be made was as old as the family. Stability over scandal. Optics over messy truth. When he spoke, he did not read a script. He said only what he intended to mean. I cannot be part of a decision that abandons her when she needs help, he said softly. The room registered it like a punch. Ji-won-yu's expression did not waver. You must think of the family's interests, she said. You must think of the foundation, the contracts. There is a way to move forward without causing more damage. Shu looked at her, at the people whose signatures controlled calendars and corporations. What I have seen in the hospital is more important than any document on a desk, he said, his voice steady. If the cost of thinking is choosing carefully, I will pay it. It was, for the family, an unscheduled variable. For Manli, who had already issued her own statement and fashioned her distance into a tidy spectacle, it was offensive. For Shu, it was the moment he realized how much he was willing to lose. That night, after the meeting, Manli's team drafted a new piece of PR, a courteous, formal disassociation. It was clean, crisp, and designed to disbar gossip from the ledger of decorum. She published it with an image of a smile, and a caption that sounded like a resignation, for the sake of clarity, and for our family's shared futures. I will step back while investigations proceed. The tone read like victory. It was not a scream, it was a sealed, diplomatic close. Shu read it with his hands on the rail of the hospital corridor. He could feel the weight of being politely excised. She had not had to shout. She had only to sign. She had performed the precise act of shutting him out. The moment when the fiancé shut him out was both smaller and larger than people imagined. One statement, one cool photograph, one logistical divorce of support. But it mattered because it fixed the choice in light for him. In the hospital's fluorescent quarter hours, as the machines ticked without impatience, Shu felt the old pattern of his life collapse into a single clear question. What is he willing to lose for what is right? He chose. Then not by proclamation in front of flashing cameras, but by action. He arranged for an independent counsel to represent Shu Xin's interests. He hired a private investigator to trace the origins of the doctored images. He pushed for an internal review at the paper to consider how they had treated her. He made calls that would have, months earlier, been routed through a longer chain of permission. None of his moves were theatrical. They were practical. They were resolute. They were, in small increments, reframing the life he had led into one that matched the person he was trying to become. Outside, in the vestibule, where family members spoke in polite tones about estate planning, Manli considered the costs to her image. She had done what was expected, and the world had reflected back her efficiency. But what the public did not know, and what would later make the story complicated, was how private decisions have consequences that the public ledger cannot track. For every public disassociation, there were private fractures. At the bedside, Shu Xin remained sedated, a small strand of hair on the pillow like a comma. The machines whispered measurements. Mingshu sat with his hands folded, thinking of band-aids, and the way they held fragile things together. For the first time in a long time, he felt the distinct and disorienting clarity that comes when the map you have been given fails. A world reduced to a sin. The last scene of this part, before the tide of evidence and the long days of legal work and the slow unfurling of consequences could begin, was not a triumph and it was not a defeat. It was a hinge. In a hallway fragrant with antiseptic and the quiet of people trying not to break the rules of sorrow, Mingshu stood as if at an open door. On one side lay the elegant life the world expected of him, curated, insured, and comfortable. On the other side lay a messy, uncertain human life that offered no insurance, but asked for fidelity. When the door finally closed, it wasn't with dramatic finality. It closed as a polite, deliberate act. A short message from Manly. A curt, public statement. A board meeting sealed. He had been shut out by the fiancé. His name prudently omitted from the next press. Release and the city. Read the message, loud and clear. What he discovered in the pause after that closing, while the machines kept counting breaths, and the reporters filed their narratives, was what the title promised. An unadorned truth about what mattered. Money could buy expertise, buy scans, buy time. It could not buy the thing that kept him at the bedside. The sense that to love someone was to choose, every day, the arduous work of being present. He had discovered that a life measured by the small acts of care had a different currency than the one he had been taught to value at the family table. In the corridor light, he picked up the napkin he had once noticed him fold in a different life. He smoothed it between his fingers, as if testing the memory of an earlier kindness. Then he stood and walked down the hall to the file cabinet in the hospital office and began, quietly, to convert privilege into protection. It would not be a clean or easy path. It would require legal fights, whispers in boardrooms, the unwilling work of exposing what some would rather keep quiet. It would also require a reckoning with his mother, with Ji Wanyu, and with the social currency that had once shaped every story for him. He pressed his palm to the cool of the cabinet, and let that be the first, simple act of choice. If you find yourself already pulled in, if you want to see what happens when facts begin to surface and reputations collide, stay with this story. The truth, when it arrives, is not always gentle. He began with the small things that never made the headlines. Chain of custody folders, encrypted drives, receipt stubs from a cafe, where a conspirator had met an accomplice. In the hospital office, beneath the fluorescent hum, Ji Mingshu folded paper into lists the way someone else might fold a map. His hands moved like a man who'd been trained to steward a fortune. He made budgets for honesty, allocated counsel hours, assigned someone to sit with the family who had come forward with a hesitant memory. Every pragmatic move was also a confession to himself. He had the means to do more than sentiment. The question was whether that meant he would. He hired professionals, good ones. People who did not chase cameras. Qin Yu delivered a forensic imaging specialist, who insisted on working from analog prints, as well as digital files. The analyst spoke in precise, dry sentences. Color profiles didn't match. Sensor noise did not cohere with the camera model claimed. Compression artifacts betrayed multiple resaves. It was a sort of language that felt like a narrow, sterile triumph. It dismantled insinuation with facts, rather than fury. Mingshu watched the report with fingers curled around a cup of coffee gone cold, and felt a loyalty in the presence of objectivity. Facts did not redeem the hurt. They built a case. At the bedside, Shu Xin lay like someone paused between chapters. Her face was thinner, the bruise by her temple, a pale bruise of memory. Machines counted what hearts and lungs could not speak. Doctors called consults that named things in measured, careful ways. We have to be conservative about prognoses, the neurologist said the first time he spoke to them. She has post-concussive symptoms and confusion. We'll need serial, cognitive testing, and a plan for rehabilitation. There's a pregnancy, which complicates some imaging and medications. We must coordinate obstetrics, neurology, and psychiatry carefully. The words, pregnancy, and complicates landed with a metallic clatter. Mingshu's chest tightened in ways that felt like an obligation, and like a tether. He listened as a maternal-fetal specialist explained options and risks, used phrases like gestational age and viability, with the same impartiality as an engineer describing load-bearing beams. When Shu Xin opened her eyes for the first time, they were slow to focus. She blinked at the intrusion of monitors, and at the unfamiliar face that had been keeping watch. "You're awake," Mingshu said, as if it were news to the room and not to his own chest. She tried to smile, and then gave up the attempt. When the muscles disagreed, where she started, and then the remainder of the sentence reorganized itself. What happened? There was no neat recounting yet. Memory had the leathery texture of something that would be unfolded in small, careful ways. The doctors spoke of sedation, of the need to avoid stress, of protecting both mother and fetus. Mingshu explained, simply, who he was to her, but not the Egista renta boyfriend receipt, and the curious ways they had come to know each other. Were delicate particulars he did not force into the first light of her consciousness. She agreed to the tests with a professional steadiness that had always been part of her and editor's practicality. Decide the data you need. Gather it. Then make a decision. If there are records, I want them. She murmured days later, when she could tolerate being upright for 10 minutes at a time, not for headlines, for clarity. That insistence, that desire to convert grief and confusion into documents was the pulse that steadied many of the hours to come. While Mingshu assembled his legal and medical teams, Shu Xin began to read the files they brought her, line by line, like someone reassembling a torn article. She asked for timing logs, metadata printouts, the original uploads. She nodded when the staff explained how such things mattered. Her role in the recovery was not to be a passive vessel. It was to be a steward of facts, where she could. Meanwhile, the forensic path of the smear began to yield names. People in the minority that make scandals, run smoothly fixers, social managers, the occasional intern hungry for a connectional left faint trails. The imaging analysts matched an IP address used to seed an account to a rented office that traced back to a PR consultancy, often hired by wealthy families in delicate negotiations. Further subpoenas revealed transfer receipts between an account associated with a high-end floral delivery company and a shell consultant. The money trails were neat and indirect. They had been designed to be plausible, deniability. It was a not accidental pattern. It pointed to networks, rather than to a single, disgruntled teenager. At one of the quiet Monday meetings, the private investigator slid a small audio file across the table and said, without flourish, listen. They did. The recording was poor, the kind of compressed tape that could have been dulled by a dozen devices, but the voices were audible. A woman, with a clipped, deliberate tone, instructing someone about making sure the right posts go up, about controlling the narrative, until our statement is ready. There was a second voice, younger, hesitant, and then a short, sharp snarl. Do it. Don't ask questions. Mingshu had not expected a recorded voice to hit him so hard. He had prepared for paper proofs, for pixel analysis, for the kind of legal trench warfare that required patience. He had not prepared for the intimate cruelty in a voice deciding another's suffering as a tactical move. The voice in the recording would later be matched, through further investigation, to a number of contacts around Manly's circle, people who had been briefed during crisis simulations, and who had, when asked, reacted with a horror then denial rhythm. Publicly, the smear continued to roll through the less scrupulous corners of social media. Privately, the investigators built a lattice of evidentiary threads. They traced messages, cross-referenced bank transfers, obtained statements from participants who had been coerced into silence, and were suddenly, under the pressure of law, willing to tell the truth. One of them was Wei Qihao, a minor player who had been tangentially involved in the high school incidents and in later online harassment. His testimony was messy and contradictory and human. He admitted that threats had been made, that he had been paid to impersonate, to reply, to make comments. He said he had been afraid and apologetic. Wei Qihao testified before the police, with the shaky voice of someone who had lived under a cloud of coercion. His admission opened doors. He named names that investigators followed until they led, inevitably, to the outer perimeter of a pattern connecting Manly's campaign strategy and the financial incentives that had lubricated it. The police case, once it moved from whisper to warren, did not move as a melodramatic sprint. It was, by design and necessity, procedural and slow. Evidence had to be logged, witnesses had to be guaranteed protection, and legal teams needed time to ensure that when the truth reached the public, it would arrive within the scaffolding of admissible proof. Shu insisted on transparency in a way that surprised some in his circle. He publicly released the forensic analyst's summary, masking only the private medical details that Shu Xin had asked to keep confidential. He refused the temptation to use his family's channels to smother the story quietly. If the family would be judged for daring to abuse social capital, he wanted the judgment to be about truth, not about hush. That posture angered Ji Wanyu at first. The matriarch viewed open release as a breach of discipline, something that could burn relationships and end contracts. The family board called him to task. "We take a different route," Ji Wanyu told him. "You cannot lead with emotion in this arena," he answered in a way that surprised them both. "I'm not leading with emotion," he said. "I'm making sure the truth is handled by people who know how to guard it." There was a steadiness in that sentence that had not existed when he had been a younger man, more malleable to family calculus. It was a small reorientation, part personal conviction, part strategic decision. Then the custodial tragedy happened, and nothing felt small. Wei Wei, one of the coerced participants, who had tentatively agreed to cooperate, died in custody while under protective detention. The official report labeled it an unexplained medical event, and there were immediate denials of negligence. But the public could not be so starkly medicated against suspicion. Journalists converged. Families demanded independent reviews. Shu did not try to shield the police. He demanded, publicly and privately, an independent coroner's review and an investigation into custodial conditions. He used money for accountability, not for cover. He insisted that the truth be pursued even when it risked exposing systems he partly benefited from. The investigation into the custodial death found lapses, delays in medical response, poor record-keeping, and failures to communicate pre-existing conditions to the detention center staff. The coroner's follow-up did not produce a neat conclusion about intent. What it did produce was a Rikaninga public apology from the detention authority, administrative suspensions for custody officers, and a civil suit initiated by Wei Wei's family. It also produced a darker, more complicated public conversation. How often are the vulnerable used as buffers in conspiracies, then discarded when they become inconvenient? The state could not resolve all of that in a press release, but responsibility had at least shifted into a place where it could be examined. This was not the tidy sort of cinematic vengeance. It was a messy accountability that left many people unsatisfied because the wounds did not close in a single court decision. For Shu, it confirmed something. Power used defensively is not the same as power used destructively. He had the means to bury a story. Instead, he chose to fund an inquiry that made his family uncomfortable. When Ji Wanyu learned of his insistence on an independent coroner, there was a blistered silence between them. He had crossed a line she believed sacrosanct: loyalty to the family's image. He had, in her view, risked more than a relationship. He had risked a dynasty of curated reputations, but as evidence accumulated metadata that showed image resaves, bank transfers to intermediaries, recordings of instructions, public pressure mounted. One of Manley's aides, a woman whose job had been to manage crises, finally broke under the weight and made a recorded statement. She had arranged for the release strategy. She had coordinated with accounts to seed the rumor. She had participated in the campaign because she feared for her employment. She regretted it. She named Manley as the primary strategist. An allegation Manley's team denied in blunt legalese. At a point when the legal battleground seemed dense with motions and countermotions, a single piece of evidence punctured the air. A live-streamed snippet from a charity event where Manley had quietly lobbed a thinly veiled threat at a journalist who had suggested she might feel culpable. The clip showed a private moment that had been recorded by a volunteer who did not intend it for distribution. The essence of the clip was not violence, but the casualness of orders given. "Make it quiet," Manley said, almost conversationally, when she had perceived an inconvenience to her campaign. The stream's comment section had been dormant until someone noticed the line. Then the clip was everywhere. That casual cruelty proved combustible. In the court of public opinion, it was not always enough. In the court of law, it was corroborative. Investigators triangulated her communications with the patterns of payment and the timing of posts. Manley's lawyers pushed back fiercely. She filed countersuits and hired high-profile defenders. The legal machinery groaned under the weight of money, influence, and reputational defense. The city watched as two modes of power confronted each other: the power to anonymize harm, and the power to make harm visible. Shu Xin, for all the fragility of her early recovery, was not idle. Cognitive rehabilitation included reading short passages and dictating notes. She wrote, at first in halting sentences, and then with increasing fluency, memos that described her interactions with the newsroom and with the men who had pressured her. She insisted that her editorial voice be heard, not as vindication but as a demonstration of competence. "I don't want the narrative to be she was hurt, and then found a man," she told Mingshu one afternoon when therapy allowed her outdoor visits. "I want the narrative to be that I refused to sell the truth. That matters." Those words were small, quiet corrections to the way people expected a story like theirs to be performed. She conferred with the paper's independent ombudsman, who had grown interested in their case. Together, they drafted a path for redress, an internal review of editorial decisions, a public statement acknowledging procedural failures, and a pledge to improve support and safety for staff targeted by public harassment. The paper's leadership, pilloried and embarrassed, had to choose between preservation and reform. Under pressure and fearing deeper legal exposure, they issued an apology and promised structural changes. Shu Xin's insistence had produced concrete results. She had not been rescued by a man. She had used the tools at her disposal. The slow unspooling of truth had consequences in the Geo household. Manley, whose image had been polished for years by advisors, found her public associations fraying. Sponsors withdrew, partnerships were re-examined, and board members who had once welcomed her took careful steps away. She responded with aggression litigation, counterclaims about defamation, and an attempt to pivot the story into an argument about being a victim of social media misinterpretation. In private, some in her circle suggested she negotiate a quiet settlement that would return her to the family tapestry. Publicly, she denied wrongdoing. The decisive moment came not in a courtroom drama, but in a press conference held by the police and legal counsel. An analyst stood and gave a testimony that translated pixels into motive. A witness affirmed the chain of command of the smear. A bank manager explained transfers to intermediaries now forfeited in an injunction. The police announced pending charges for conspiracy to defame and for arranging harassment. They also announced an inquiry into the custodial conditions that had contributed to Weiwei's death. The media room smelled of stale coffee and adrenaline. Members of the public who had once pored over the smears with gleeful cruelty now watched the flip side, the machinery of consequences. Min Shu, in the press room, refused to grandstand. He stepped forward with a quiet, clear line. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. He spoke of evidence, of process, of the need for institutions to protect the vulnerable. He refused to let his words be turned into a chest-thumping performance. He wanted to be accountable for the actions he took. "We will pursue the truth without weaponizing pain," he said. "There will be no private settlements to silence the story. There will be." Manley looked at him as if at an unexpected crossroads. It was then that she attempted what the press would later call a final gambit. In a live moment, an ambush at a charity fundraiser, she cornered him, attempted to extract a private concession, and threatened to make public a false narrative that would tie the pregnancy to scandalous claims. The scene was recorded by staff and volunteers, and within hours the footage had been sent to investigators. She approached Ming Shu with a steady facade, and then raised her voice in a way the cameras captured. Her team would later argue that she had been defending her reputation. Investigators knew better. Tone and proximity suggested coercion. The law would look at it as an attempt to obstruct justice by manufacturing a new smear. The legal consequences for Manley were not immediate crucifixions. She was first summoned for questioning, then faced civil suits, and then, as evidence mounted, criminal investigations. Sponsors who had once flocked to her image withdrew. Contracts evaporated. The family board convened to discuss reputational damage and its financial implications. Ji Wenyu, forced to reckon with the public record, did so with painful clarity. The matriarch had always publicly prioritized stability. Privately, she had used stability to avoid facing injustice. Watching the evidence close like a net, she had a choice. Preserve a version of the family that had always preferred silence, or accept that the family's health required transparency. When she chose transparency, it was not a conversion so much as a pragmatic admission that the older calculus had failed them. In the slow weeks after the press conference, truth settled into specific acts of reparation. Contracts between Manley's circle and certain vendors were scrutinized and put under injunction. The PR firm that had orchestrated the seeding of false accounts faced fines and a suspension. Weiwei's family received both a formal apology and funds for legal costs, and the detention supervisors who had ignored medical alerts were placed under investigation. These restorations were partial and hard-earned. They did not erase the harm, but they made the institutions that enabled it accountable. Shu Xin's rehabilitation continued in orderly steps. Speech therapy, cognitive assessments, and the slow patience of someone learning how to trust a body again. She became a symbol for colleagues who had been silenced, someone who refused to be reduced to shame. Her writing changed. It became crisper, less interested in melodrama, and more interested in mechanics. How a rumor could damage a life, and how institutions could be made to repair what they'd broken. The paper offered her, tentatively at first, a role in the review process. When the review concluded that the newsroom had failed to protect a staff member targeted by coordinated harassment, they offered Shu Xin the editorial oversight of news safety protocols. It was an important recognition of competence, rather than pity. Time, too, slid toward decisions. For Ming Shu, the family pressure had not vanished. Invitations remained withheld, and boardroom chairs carried a quieter frost when he entered, but he had already made choices. He stepped down from some of his ceremonial roles with the foundation not because he sought to abandon duty, but because he wanted to redirect the organization's funds toward survivors' support programs and digital safety initiatives. It was a symbolic renunciation of the trappings he had been comfortable with. It was also a practical move. He allocated budgets to independent charities, and insisted that grants be structured with oversight, to ensure they reached people, rather than PR metrics. His mother, when he told her, replied with a silence that carried decades. Ji Wanyu did not explode. She recalibrated. There was bargaining, of course, an exchange of terms, and a test of boundaries. But, when Mingshu presented concrete plans for how the foundation could make reparations, and support victims of harassment and abuse, she listened. It was a hard conversion for her. To understand the family's wealth as a lever for correction, rather than a shield for comfort, it required humility, which she had not practiced much, but which she offered in private conversations with him later. "You have made the family uncomfortable in the way truth can," she said at one point. Small and raw, but perhaps it was necessary. There were private conversations between the couple that were not theatrical. They walked in short loops around a hospital garden when Shu Xin's stamina allowed it. They argued, quietly, over the meaning of community. Mingshu apologized for the many ways his silence had once protected others at the expense of ethics. She accepted that apology without absolution. Acceptance was not a blanket. She demanded responsibility, action, and an old-fashioned commitment to show up. He promised, not with grandiose vows, but in small, deliberate choices. He would be present, he said. He would fund therapy, legal counsel, and their continued safety. He would accept public scrutiny, for the sake of being accountable. Her pregnancy advanced slowly under medical supervision. Obstetricians spoke about cautious optimism. There were risks, they said, but nothing in the scans suggested immediate catastrophe. They repeated counsel in tones designed to be sober rather than comforting. Nutritional plans, rest, targeted imaging, only when necessary. The couple's conversations about the future were not giddy predictions. They were careful negotiations about time, support systems, and workloads. They planned for parental duties, as if drafting a project timeline. Who would take mornings off for checkups? Who would handle certain phone calls? How to protect the child's privacy in a climate that had already weaponized too much. The city watched as the couple performed small acts of normalcy. Mingshu bringing soup he had learned to make, under the instruction of a quiet cook, Shu Xin. Teaching a junior reporter how to cross-check sources. Their gestures were not always dramatic. Many were simply exercises in endurance. But they mattered. They communicated a different kind of wealth, the capacity to reassemble a life with attention. When the public trial loomed, it did so with the awkwardness of reality. Courtrooms are not theaters, and justice has the patient rhythm of discovery. Witnesses who had been intimidated came forward under protection. Financial forensic teams laid out transaction histories. The PR firm founder, cornered by evidence, accepted a plea regarding negligent use of client funds, and was compelled to internal reforms. Manley herself faced both civil and criminal exposure. The trial did not produce a single Hollywood verdict, so much as a set of judicial findings and, in some cases, convictions for the lesser, provable, offenses. The public reaction was variegated. Some called the outcomes insufficient. Others felt that even this limited accountability was better than a blank slate. In court, Mingshu never sought ostentation. He testified in a measured, believable way about his presence at the bedside, the payments made for care, and the steps taken to ensure that truth would be adjudicated, rather than suppressed. When his mother was called, she gave a statement that read like someone learning a new, awkward language of responsibility. A public acknowledgement of the harm that had come from prioritizing silence, and a pledge to cooperate in institutional reform. It was not an episcopal confession, it was a small legal and moral correction. When the judge issued rulings that required restitution, transparency, and the suspension of certain contracts that had funded the smear operations, there was a curve of vindication that was thin but real. Victims were compensated in ways that mattered, and which could not erase the past. Legal reforms discussed in op-eds and parliamentary committees suggested structural change in how harassment and defamation were treated online and within professional networks. Much of that would take time. The instant change that the tabloids craved did not materialize. Instead, there was a long, public conversation about the ethics of reputation management. The final act, quiet and profound, came not in a courtroom, but in a small room, with a window that looked out on a line of plane trees. Shu Xin had been cleared to move back into a modest apartment, while continuing rehabilitation. She had been offered, in recognition of her editorial rigor and leadership, the role of editor-in-chief, in a project that the paper agreed to launch. A dedicated desk, focusing on digital harms and institutional accountability. It was a job that would give her agency over the very mechanisms that had once tried to bury her. She accepted it with a sober happiness, a recognition that her skills mattered, and that she could turn her experience into institutional change. Ming Shu, standing across from her in that room, felt the gravity of a choice he had already made. He would not, he decided, reposition his life into a simplified narrative of rescue. He would change the structures that made rescue necessary. He tendered his resignation from a set of ceremonial positions and reallocated the foundation's discretionary funds to support the new editorial initiative, survivor assistance, and independent forensics. He made the move public not for applause, but because he wanted the decision to be transparent. Ji Wanyu read the public statement and folded it into the ledger of the family's life. She called him later that week, and what she said was brief and weighted. "You have made choices that will cost us," she said, "but you have not made them without thought. That may be the only measure I can value now." He had learned that winning a parent's approval would not redeem the past. What redeemed him was the patient accumulation of responsible acts. Manley received a sentence that included fines and restrictions, and compelled community service, combined with mandatory counseling. She had lost the public stage she'd cultivated. She faced the consequences of her choices. There was no romantic cinematic for Lonely. A sober reconfiguration of her life, under legal scrutiny, and a grudging, bitter, and at times, performative remorse. Some would argue that her punishment was too light. Others would say it was merciful. The real point was not revenge. It was that the structures that permitted abuse had been called to account. The months after the trial were the slowest. Healing rarely has the fullness of a triumph. Shu Xin's recovery progressed in increments. Less confusion about names, better endurance for interviews, an increasing ability to plan a day. Her pregnancy matured under the watchful tenderness of a medical team, and a network who had learned to prioritize safety. Ming Shu learned the rituals of care. He learned to do the small things that make a life livable. The timing of a medication, the naming of a paper's editorial calendar, the patience to sit through multiple therapy appointments without turning them into errands. On the day that the hospital cleared Shu Xin to leave for a longer stretch at home, she and Ming Shu walked out together with a small package of belongings, and the quiet thrumming of city life around them. Cameras waited, but the couple moved with calibrated calm. He opened the car door for her like an old habit, and she adjusted the seatbelt around her midsection, with the same practical focus she had once used to arrange interview appointments. Neither was performative. Both were intimate in a way only private gestures can be. They did not rush to marriage announcements, or to grand public celebrations. Instead, they wrote joint statements about their goals: to support survivors, to fund independent investigative journalism, and to commit to raising a child in a household where truth mattered more than appearances. They spoke to the press about accountability without posing their path as a moral template. They acknowledged that harm had been done, and that their responses were not perfect, only honest. There was, eventually, a small ceremony, not a spectacle but a deliberate gathering of people who had been part of the truthful scaffolding of their days. A few friends, some colleagues who had stood by them, legal counsels, doctors, and a couple of family members who had chosen to reconcile in the wake of what had happened. Ji Wanyu, attended with a face that had softened not into sentiment, but into acceptance. She brought a modest gift, a praline box, and a note that read, "Choose well." It was austere, but it meant something. Shu Xin did not become a parable of suffering overcome by romance. She became a person who was allowed to be fallible and capable at once. Mingshu did not become a sanctified martyr for love. He became a man who recognized that the currency of responsibility is daily and prosaic, and sometimes lonely. Their promise to each other was less a vow than a series of agreements. To listen, to fund accountability, and to protect. In their apartment, late one evening, they sorted through a small pile of items stored from the months of upheaval. A hospital bracelet, a forensic analyst's binder, a folded napkin from the first night they met. Shu Xin picked up a tiny pair of baby socks. She had bought them on a whim months earlier when a friend had mentioned that it was nice to imagine someday. She placed them on the table between them. "Will it be strange?" she asked. "To build a life that isn't designed to impress?" Mingshu looked at the socks, and then at the city glowing beyond their window. "It will be the most honest thing we'll have," he said. "And if it costs us something, we'll know what we gave for because we chose it." They clasped hands over the table, quiet, unpublicized, and ordinary. It was a scene without a camera angle, without a swelling score. It was simply a human bargain. Fidelity to what matters, a pledge to care, and a willingness to be visible in the way that accountability requires. The months that followed were not free of difficulty. There were op-eds and critical voices, occasional legal wrangling, and the ongoing work of therapy and medical monitoring, but they had concrete systems in place. Legal teams that pursued ongoing inquiries, a foundation that funded forensic training for journalists, and an editorial desk that amplified survivor stories. Without sensationalism, the couple negotiated parenthood with thoughtful rhythms. Who would take time when the child arrived, how they would handle media requests, how they would build a safe online presence for the family. When the child came, Helfer, small, a new life that contained no public agenda. There was no grand announcement. A photograph, later released, at their discretion, showed a small hand curled around a finger. They had decided against the kind of curative reveal that had once been the currency of their world. The picture, simple and honest, matched everything they'd learned. Life is measured not in curated impressions but in the daily acts of care. Years later, at a modest inauguration for a program Mingshu's foundation funded, one that provided legal aid for people targeted by online harassment, he stood and spoke about choices and costs, with the steady voice of someone who had learned a hard arithmetic. "The choice is not always dramatic," he said. "Often it is a decision to be present in ordinary ways. That presence costs something. Reputation, comfort, certainty, but the alternative, silence, costs everything else." Shu Xin, sitting in the audience with their child asleep in her lap, listened with the writer's attention. She had learned, the hard way, that being visible meant being accountable. She had learned to write clear rules into the institutions that had once failed her. Her editorial desk had helped reframe the paper's relationship with its workforce, and with digital harms. She was not a perfect advocate, no one is, but she had become the steward of many small, necessary changes. The city moved on, as cities do. News stories flared and dimmed, but the traces of what happened remained in policy updates, in suspended contracts, and in the memory of people who had been hurt. Their story did not become an instructive legend, it remained a stubborn, human example of what choices can look like when they are made in light, instead of convenience. If anyone asked what had precipitated the change, what lightning struck the man who had been the heir to a carefully curated life, answer was simple and stubbornly ordinary. The woman he had been told to forget, the small acts that add up to care, and a declaration of disassociation uttered as a matter of public optics. When his fiancée shut him out, she did more than reject an engagement. She provided him with a clear line to choose by. He chose to be present. The final image of their story is not fireworks or fanfare, but a small domestic tableau. A pair of baby socks folded neatly in a drawer beside an analyst's binder, and a hospital bracelet on the wall opposite. A photograph taken not for cameras, but for their own memory shows. Two hands clasped over a kitchen table. The skyline outside glitters, indifferent and beautiful. Inside, layered in the quiet, a different currency had been established. Fidelity measured in acts of care, reputation measured by accountability, and a life measured by who came to the bedside when things were difficult. If you were moved by their choices, Sif, the way they reorganized their lives around truth and presence matters to you, consider watching other stories that look at the cost of doing the right thing. Share an example in the comments of a small act that made a big difference in your life. Sometimes the most ordinary loyalties become the clearest proofs of what matters.